Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Wednesday, March 27th, and we are going to be getting into some college basketball for the show today. We are going to start with the Sweet 16 tipping off tomorrow night. We're going to be reseeding / power ranking the 16 remaining teams in the NCAA tournament. Then we are going to be also touching on the coaching carousel that is starting to develop there. Already have a handful of hires, as well as the news that John Calipari will be back at Kentucky next season. So we'll be reacting to all of that. In the second half of the show, we will be sticking with the theme of basketball that also can have some parallels to some news that has been developing in college basketball, going to the NBA and the scandal around the Toronto Raptors' Jontay Porter, who is being investigated for some irregularities in prop betting on him that has a lot of people talking about the gambling era in sports altogether now that we have all of this regulation and the implications that we're seeing with these various athletes getting caught. We referenced it yesterday, but I want to dive more into the Jontay Porter specific scenario here. And then finally, we are going to wrap up the show by talking about the NFL and the owners meeting that has just taken place over the course of the past couple seasons, and we have some rule changes that could potentially shake up the league, so you won't want to miss that. Now, before we get into our show here, getting into our first segment of the day, though, we have the reseeding / power rankings of the 16 remaining teams in the NCAA tournament. This was not the easiest exercise to do necessarily. There were a couple spots where I feel like I had to balance the teams that I'm rooting for and ultimately how I feel about them going forward. The seeding format here also sort of helped to put it into tiers as well, but that's also where sometimes, specifically if you look at the bottom of the 2 seeds and the top of the 3 seeds, it's really hard to pick some of those teams over one another. So again, not the easiest exercise in the world for me, but at the same time, I had to go with my gut and go with some of the key facts. But all of this being said, the 1 seeds that I have in this reseeding exercise, I have UConn, Houston, Purdue, and Arizona. I do still have, I mean, UConn sort of goes without saying in this. They've been the best team in the country really all season long. They have 2 dominant wins to start off this tournament. They are the reigning national champions and have been playing like it. So hard to really switch up on that. It's how I've felt all season, really. And here we are, and they are advancing to the Sweet 16 with ease. I do still have Houston over Purdue. I know that a lot of people are sort of shifting into more of a Purdue mindset. I think that a lot of people are overlooking Houston because of how close that game versus Texas A&M was at the end. They allowed 95 points in that game. They put A&M at the free throw line 45 times. Luckily, the Aggies couldn't knock them down. Lucky for them. And if they were to put a lot of other teams at the free throw line that many times, specifically the upcoming Duke, they're not going to win a matchup like that. But despite how close the game was, despite how many things went against the Cougars in this one, I thought that it was a solid win to show that they could win in a different way. Their offense really led the way, which is a bit uncharacteristic, almost in a good way, for Houston this past week. And this was the best win from any 1 or 2 seed in the tournament in my eyes. I thought that A&M was going to be a tough matchup going into it. They were. I think that A&M could have knocked off a couple of these other teams. I think they would have been tough for Purdue, and I think that they potentially could have beaten UNC. Along with the free throws in this game, Houston was also able to win with 4 of their 5 starters fouling out. Their defense didn't perform to the level we expect of them maybe, but their offense showed that they are capable of winning some high-powered offensive games as well. And don't get it twisted, this is an elite defensive team. They actually fell because of this to the number 2 overall defense. But again, I have faith in Kelvin Sampson and the infrastructure of this team. Jamal Shed is a leader of all leaders, and I think that Houston is still a very tough out, despite some people souring on them. I had Purdue at number 3. Can't drop them outside of the top 3. Really, it's been these 3 teams in UConn, Houston, and Purdue all the way through the season. Purdue has dominated their way through the first 2 rounds. They've won their games by a combined score of 67, so ridiculous stuff there. Zach Edey has put up 53 points, 35 rebounds, and 6 blocks in these first 2 games. He is clearly a mismatch that very few teams are properly equipped to handle, and that's great. But what happens when they do run into a team that can play Edey better? How will the rest of their guys step up? I think that Trey Kaufman-Renn has an argument to have been their second best player through these first couple games. He has really impressed me, someone who only averaged just above 6 points per game during the season, but has been really impressive in a handful of ways with some of the rebounding, second chance points, forcing the other teams into foul trouble as well. You expect Edey to draw a lot of fouls, but specifically against Utah State, I thought that Kaufman-Renn did a very good job of that as well. Lawyer, Jones, and Braden Smith haven't been bad, but they also haven't stood out to me tremendously yet in the tournament. Now, Purdue hasn't needed them to, so that's a big part of it. Braden Smith had 10 assists in that game against Utah State, or was it the first game? 10 assists in one of these games, as it was anyways. So, again, not like they have really had to be called on frequently yet, but when they do, what is that going to look like? Ultimately, I went with Houston over Purdue because that's how I felt headed into the tournament, and honestly, nothing has swayed me yet. Now, I can see how some people would sort of be bought over by Purdue. I mean, this was a massive weekend for them last week, being able to overcome sort of the fraud allegations that surrounded them because they were the 1 seed that was upset last season, but an incredible start to the tournament for them, and now they are pretty much out of harm's way from losing to a bad surprise program where we had, in a lot of ways, a very chalk Sweet 16 here, and it is really just the best of the best. There really isn't that embarrassing loss that could come their way going forward. So credit to Matt Painter and Purdue for being able to bounce back. Let's see how long their run can last. But again, it's been those 3 teams at the top, and then that 4th team, the final number 1 seed, has been more of a debate going back to even entering the tournament, and even still now, there are arguments you can make for a couple teams here. I decided to go with Arizona. They have 2 very convincing wins, but they have also dealt with some level of adversity, at least. Long Beach State, they were playing for their coach who was fired before the conference tournament. They had some motivation there. They kept it close in the first half, but they just were not able to keep up with the Wildcats down the stretch. Arizona ended up winning by 20. And then in that second game in the round of 32 against Dayton, they controlled the Flyers all the way through. They got the lead up to 17 points at one point, and Dayton just didn't let up. They had just come off of a game where they came back from 17 to beat Nevada, and they kept playing them hard, would not quit in this game. It forced Arizona to play a full 40 minutes, and they did so convincingly. So I thought that the first two rounds, not that they've been extremely battle-tested, but ultimately a very solid performance on their end that continues to build on an impressive season where they have a top 10 offense and a top 10 defense. They have a lot of dangerous players with experience. Their whole starting lineup has been in the tournament other than Kylan Boswell, who is the youngest of the group. He's a sophomore. The rest of them are all seniors. You have some championship game experience in Caleb Love, who was in the national championship game with UNC a few years ago. You have Kashad Johnson, the transfer from San Diego State, who last year went to the national championship game. Not to mention Tommy Lloyd took this program with the likes of Umar Ballo and Pele Larson to the Elite Eight in 2022. So Arizona's a very impressive squad. Again, I don't think that this was a runaway necessarily for them being the final number 1 seed, but that is where I landed on. The 2 seeds, I have Iowa State, UNC, Illinois, and Tennessee. I feel like Iowa State is the most underrated team remaining in the tournament. I thought that they were disrespected entering Selection Sunday as they were the final number 2 seed, the number 8 overall, but they've really been taking it to teams lately, even dating back to the Big 12 tournament game where they blew out Houston. They had an argument to some degree for the number 1 seed, the final remaining number 1 seed headed into the tournament in my eyes, but the selection committee didn't see it that way and dropped them down a bunch. I do think that Washington State is a better win than a lot of people want to give them credit for. I mentioned how Houston has dropped down to number 2 in defense. That is because Iowa State has surpassed them for number 1. So that is their identity and something to look forward to. UNC was the only 1 seed that I dropped down outside of the top 4. They were, as we've sort of alluded to, the least convincing 1 seed headed into the tournament. I thought that Iowa State had a case for it. You could make some arguments that Tennessee could have been in there. Maybe if they had won their tournament, they probably would have been. But the Tar Heels are still a very good team. We've seen them be elite defensively at times, and they're going to need to tap into that potential in their upcoming matchup against Alabama, who, of course, has one of the most high-powered offenses in the country. But speaking of high-powered offenses, that takes us to Illinois, who is another team I sort of shuffled around here, not sure exactly where to put them. I went with the number 7 overall spot here. Their offense has been so elite this season. They've especially been on another level since the beginning of the Big Ten tournament. They are currently the number 1 offense in the nation, according to KenPom. Terrence Shannon Jr. has been on an absolute heater, averaging 31.6 points per game in their last 5 games, all of them postseason from the Big Ten tournament to now these first couple NCAA tournament games. The issue is with Illinois, and the reason why I initially had them higher, but I dropped them down as I went further into it, was the fact that we have seen teams similar to Illinois that heavily rely on their offense to carry them through the way. We've seen them struggle to make it in the entirety of the run in March Madness because because of the fact that they have this great offense, but they don't have the defense necessarily to complement it, and it's very hard to win 6 games in a row just relying on your offense. They are the number 92 defensive team in the country. They've been playing well on that end through these first couple games, but I've had a pretty easy schedule with Morehead State in the first round and Duquesne last round. So we'll see how this progresses for them. Again, they are probably going to have to play a different brand of basketball to some degree against Iowa State when that game tips off tomorrow night. Should be one of the games of the weekend. Tennessee, I had coming in as the final 2 seed. Despite playing a close game against Texas, I did think that it was a pretty key performance from the team to remind the nation what their backbone is, and that is under Rick Barnes, they have been a very defensive-minded team that's just seen this uptick in offense due to having a high-level scorer such as Dalton Connect to drop 40 bombs throughout the season. But the SEC had a very down year in terms of defense. Only 3 teams in the top 50 of defenses according to Ken Pom. Tennessee was not just the top SEC team, but they were the number 3 defense in the league, in the country that is, as a whole. Connecting the offense definitely need to get their offense going again coming into this next round where they'll take on Creighton. They can get stagnant at times, but they shot 3 of 25 last round and were from 3, that is, and they were able to win that game. Let's see if they can offensively bounce back and take it to Creighton. But that takes us into the 3 seeds where I have Marquette, Creighton, Duke, and Gonzaga. This was a scenario where it hurt me to drop Marquette down because I don't believe it's been anything that they have specifically done that maybe should have them drop down. But I think that Illinois has just been that impressive, and the ceiling with them is so high. Coming into the tournament, I was a little bit skeptical of them because of the fact that we didn't know how healthy Tyler Kolek was going to be, who missed the last handful of games headed into the tournament. But he's been healthy, and he's been great for them. Versus Colorado, the team as a whole had a very uncharacteristic game of turning the ball over. Kolek was guilty of that as well with 6 turnovers himself. They have a tough matchup ahead of them with NC State, and this is another pretty interesting matchup here where we saw them at times struggle with Eddie Lampkin. Lampkin also hurt himself by turning the ball over. We'll see how the big man DJ Burns does in this one. He's, of course, an interior force. I don't know if Marquette really has the size to body him up. Oso Ighodaro is going to need to step up in this scenario. He's taller, but Burns has 40 pounds on him, so we will see about that. Issue is with Creighton, who I really like in this tournament, is the lack of true depth. Their starting lineup is very impressive, and I am sort of dying to see them match up against Purdue because of the fact that they are such a disciplined team under Greg McDermott. They don't foul much, and that's obviously a big deal when you're facing off against Zach Edey. But Kalkbrenner is one of the best players in the country, I think, to specifically match up against Edey, the way that he's disciplined in the post, the way that he uses his size. He can shoot the 3 a little bit as well, spread Edey out. So that's something that I would like to see, but they obviously have to worry about getting through Tennessee first. I had Duke here in this spot now. I think that a lot of people are much higher on Duke than I am. They have had a very impressive start to the tournament here. They were able to beat Vermont with Kyle Filipowski only having 1 field goal attempt. Then they blew the doors off of the Cinderella, candidate in JMU. I just don't feel as good about them in these big moments where we saw them get swept against UNC during the regular season. They lost their first ACC tournament game versus NC State. When the game gets more physical for them, I do worry about them a little more. They have some more youth, and sure, they have the guys like Roach who can be some veteran performers for them here, but I think that Houston is a really tough matchup for them. They're relentless, they're physical, and a lot of people have Duke in the upset in this round. I wouldn't be too sure about that, but that's just my opinion, at least as things currently stand. Final number 3 seed I have here is Gonzaga. They've been on the upwards trajectory for months since the turn of the new year. They are 18-3. And last round, we saw them really take advantage of Hunter Dickinson's lack of mobility in the pick and roll, led to a massive offensive output for the Bulldogs. And they should be able to have at least an opportunity this upcoming game against Purdue to do a similar thing against Zach Edey, where he has never been a tremendous perimeter defender. What's it going to look like for that Purdue defense, which is much improved from last season, but what happens when you take Edey out of the paint there? If they're going to compete with Purdue, it's going to probably be a high-scoring game for them. They need to avoid fouling as much as possible and keep their best players on the court. We've seen Graham Ike get himself into foul trouble in big spots before. As their leading scorer and rebounder, he is going to need to be available for them to have a chance in this game. Rounding it out here with the 4 seeds, I have Clemson, Alabama, San Diego State, and NC State. Clemson is a very solid team all around. They were able to take it to Baylor despite their best player in PJ Hall playing only 19 minutes because of foul trouble. All season long, they have had various players step up for them in big moments. They've been able to come away with some big-time games, and I was a little worried about Clemson because of the fact that they were staggering a little bit coming into the tournament, but this is a very solid, talented team, and they should provide a pretty solid matchup against Arizona. If I'm going to be wrong about anything in this tournament as a whole, though, it is going to be Alabama, and I have them, the fact that I have them this low, I didn't like them very much coming into the tournament. They've put together some solid wins. They dominated Charleston, and they won a game that was a little bit in the mud versus Grand Canyon that I thought had a chance to potentially pull off the upset. But no, props to Alabama for winning that kind of a matchup. I did think that a lot of it sort of fell on Grand Canyon and the stagnancy on their offense, just playing a pretty ugly game there. But, of course, Alabama's offense is legit, number 4 in the country in KenPom, but my concerns with them are sort of a similar situation to Illinois, but even a little bit more heightened, where they are very reliant on their offense. Their defense has been shaky. They are a high-paced team that needs to play in a lot of shootouts to win. I know how that Grand Canyon game went, but ultimately we'll see what kind of performance they're able to put on against UNC in the coming matchup. I did unfortunately have NC State as the final seed here. I hope I'm wrong about it, but San Diego State made the national championship game last season with much of the same team other than Johnson. That's sort of why I'm leaning towards them in this scenario. I'm a sucker for Jaden Ledee. I think that he is a dog. He's been incredible so far to start the tournament. The Aztecs offense is one that can definitely get stagnant as well, but they are elite defensively, and they have the ability to sort of pull opposing teams into the mud a little bit in some of these physical games as well, in my eyes. They are a slow-paced team, so they don't let other teams necessarily run out and outpace them. NC State poses a tough matchup for Marquette with some of the size, but I do think that their run is going to be coming to an end. I hope I'm wrong, but we will see. That is all we have time for on this segment, though. We are going to be taking a break, and when we come back, we will get into the coaching updates in college basketball. So stick with us, and we will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up doing some power rankings on the remaining college basketball teams in the NCAA tournament. Now we are going to be switching into some coaching carousel of the moves that have recently taken place. We have a handful of new hirings, but before we get into those, we're going to briefly talk here about John Calipari returning to Kentucky. We talked about this at length earlier this week, so we won't spend all too much time on it, but Calipari did recently meet with Kentucky's athletic director, Mitch Barnhart, and it was determined that he will be returning for the 2024-2025 season. This does not come as a massive surprise to me. Kentucky did suffer one of, if not the biggest loss in tournament history during the Calipari era, which had a lot of people calling for his job. It's been a tough stretch here for the Wildcats, where since they made the Elite Eight in 2019, they have only won one tournament game, and that was to a double-digit seeded Providence a couple years ago. They have lost to a 15-seeded St. Peter's and a 14-seeded Oakland during that stretch as well. So some bad losses to the resume. It would have cost Kentucky $33 million, though, to move off of him this offseason. Instead, they decide to stick it out with him. I feel like one thing that does sort of get overlooked in this conversation, and I'm not saying definitively that it should outweigh the other aspects. Of course, the number one job for a coach is to win games. We all know that. But, of course, with this developing college sports atmosphere where there is so much emphasis on recruiting, there always has been recruiting, but then it's also with the NIL deals and making sure that you can retain these players once you recruit them as well. It is a lot that you have to balance here, and not that, again, this should be the number one priority. It always comes down to winning first, but something that Calipari has been amazing at during his tenure here at Kentucky has been recruiting, and that isn't going anywhere. They've had so much success. Of course, Kentucky is a big-time program, but I do think that Calipari helps sort of sell the idea of Kentucky. Come here, we can set you up nicely for the NBA and advance your career professionally. As it currently stands now, of course, we are still sitting here in March, so there's plenty of time here to see how it all unfolds, but according to 247 Sports, they currently have Kentucky as the number 2 recruiting class for the 2024-25 season. Now, as we saw this past season, they had a phenomenal recruiting class. They had all of these different freshmen that were supposed to be impact guys for them, along with a couple players in Antonio Reeves and Trey Mitchell that were seniors for the program, and they still were falling short. Again, I've covered this before. The defensive strategy and the execution for Kentucky all season was a big-time red flag for Calipari and how the program is operating, but at the same time, they're getting these guys to come in and contribute some. We'll see if he can help take that to the next level. He's definitely on thin ice at the school, and another disappointing season could be the end of him in Lexington, but we will see. I'm not sure how long-term. It was $33 million to buy him out this season. I'm not sure what the long-term outlook is just yet in terms of when they would potentially have an out. It was reported that his deal after 2019 was a lifetime contract. Calipari is now 65, I believe, so he's getting up there in age, but it's not like he is on the brink of retirement just yet. So we'll have to see how the upcoming recruiting class plays out, what goes on with their freshmen from this past season, because Rob Dillingham and Reed Shepherd are going to be clear lottery picks. They will be leaving the school. You have Antonio Reeves and Trey Mitchell that should be graduating. I believe that Reeves is out of eligibility. I'm not sure what the exact situation is with Trey Mitchell, but they were both seniors this past year, and that is probably it for them. But they also have all these other freshmen in DJ Wagner, Justin Edwards, Aaron Bradshaw, and Big Z Avicic, who are all interesting pieces to see how they play out. Maybe some of them could end up being late draft picks. Not totally sure about that. I've been higher on DJ Wagner, I think, than a lot of mock drafts have been. Justin Edwards is someone who's also had his name thrown out there as well. But a lot of these guys were 5 stars coming into Kentucky last season, and this season hasn't totally worked out for them. Will they stick another year in college? Most of them probably should. Will it be with Kentucky is another question as well. So we'll have to see how all of this plays out. But getting into some hirings that have taken place and some new faces in old faces, new places is the term. But we have Dusty May going to Michigan. Michigan had fired the former Wolverine, Juwan Howard, after just an abysmal season this past year where they were 8-24, 3-17 in conference play, and they were last in the Big Ten. Absolutely not the level of performance that you expect from this Michigan program. So they bring in Dusty May, who has led Florida Atlantic University to back-to-back NCAA tournament appearances, including last season's Final Four runs. FAU was a little bit disappointing this past year. They won a handful of games, ended up being an 8 seed, but suffered some really bad losses along the way. Again, sort of you determine how you want to weigh that, but they ended up being an 8 seed. A lot of people said they were overseeded, but again, another tournament appearance for this program in FAU that was really struggling in the years leading up to May taking over. So he was a hot commodity in this coaching carousel. He was associated with Louisville at one point. Vanderbilt was trying to make a push for him, but he ends up at Michigan, gets the upgrade to a power conference, and we'll see how it plays out for them, because Michigan is a brand that when they are good, it is usually better for the NCAA and college basketball as a whole. We'll see how long it takes him to sort of turn things around there. But like I mentioned, Vanderbilt was making a push for Dusty May. He ends up choosing Michigan, so they get a consolation prize of Mark Byington, who was previously at James Madison. He led JMU to a 32-4 record this past season, their first NCAA tournament win since 2013, when they had a first 4 win. This was their first round of 32 appearance since 1983. Vanderbilt was really bad this year. They have been really sputtering for the past handful of seasons. They were just 9-23 this past year, only 1 overall game better than the miserable Missouri program that went winless in conference play. So Vanderbilt, they've really been trying to build up the program for a handful of years. It has not been tremendous, but Byington was successful with JMU, so we will see whether or not that ends up working out for them. A big name here, maybe not the most well-known from a national perspective, but a massive story if you were keeping up with college basketball this season, was Danny Sprinkle, who was with Utah State in his first season. he is now leaving already and going to the Washington Huskies. Sprinkle has seen his coaching trajectory really skyrocket after putting together some impressive seasons at Montana State, where he led them to a couple big-time seasons there. Then it catapulted him to Utah State in the Mountain West, where this past season they went 28-7, won the Mountain West regular season title. I know that they just got embarrassed against Purdue over the weekend, but don't let that take away from the fact that this has been a great job by Sprinkle, who has had to deal with a lot of roster turnover from the past couple seasons with this program, from their players themselves to the coaching staff, where I believe this is their fourth head coaching hire in the past 5 years, something along those lines. And Sprinkle did a really good job to put this thing together and develop some of their players. We saw the season that Osobor had Greg, I forget, I'm blanking on his first name actually, but Osobor, and the way that he performed this past season. Again, 28-7, a very solid year for Utah State. There was a clear buy-in from the locker room there, and ultimately he's going to be moving on to Washington, makes another step to a power conference. Washington is actually headed to the Big Ten, so he will be, along with Dusty May, in the Big Ten in their new jobs. Final one here is Kyle Smith, who was hired by Stanford. This is a little bit of an interesting move here, where Kyle Smith, I did think, did a very solid job at Washington State this past year. I thought that they were a little bit underrated. The fact that they were a 7 seed and were underdogs against Drake, and they end up winning that game. He won 20-plus games in all of his years with San Francisco before, and now he puts together this solid season with Washington State. The Washington State is in a very weird scenario, as they currently stay in the Pac-12, as it is, the conference as a whole is really falling apart here. And now we see their head coach leaving to go with Stanford. That has at times been a good program, but have not reached the NCAA tournament since 2014. We also important to note here that this will be Stanford's upcoming first season in the ACC, so a little bit of a change there as well. I forgot there was actually one last coaching change as well, and that is Darian DeVries getting the head coaching job at West Virginia. We just talked about Washington State actually playing Drake, and that was a matchup of Kyle Smith and of DeVries here. So for this job, I mean, Drake has been a prominent mid-major school to be continuing to make the conference. 3 NCAA tournaments under Tucker DeVries. They even notably, a couple years ago, were an at-large bid. They didn't win their conference, but they were still put into the dance, and Drake has won 20 games or more in each season that DeVries has been with the team. So he ends up taking over for West Virginia. You'll remember West Virginia was a pretty prominent program just a couple years ago when Bob Huggins was there, but he got into some issues that forced West Virginia to fire him, and now they re-up here for West Virginia. I believe that his son, Tucker DeVries, who was one of the leading scorers in NCAA this season, has another year of eligibility. If that is the case, then he will probably be joining his father at West Virginia, and we could possibly see a resurgence from the program there. But that is all the news that we have for now. We're going to be taking our second break, and when we come back, we will be getting into some basketball here, some NBA, and the gambling scandals that are surrounding Jontay Porter. So stick with us, and we will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Just finished up talking some college basketball for the day. Now we're going to be getting into the NBA, but not on games itself, but the scandal that is coming out about the Toronto Raptors' Jontay Porter, who is being investigated for potentially fixing games. There was a story that came out from Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN about Porter potentially being involved in some irregularities in gambling, where there were two specific days on January 26th and March 20th where the highest, most profitable bets of the day, player prop bets that is, were on Jontay Porter unders. In both of these games, he ended up coming out and only played a few minutes, so he was eligible that the props would not get voided, but he wasn't on the court to, not necessarily, because when you look at this, you think about throwing games where it is purposefully doing bad. It wasn't that. There wasn't anything, if you look back at those games, there wasn't anything glaring about how Porter actually played that would indicate, if we didn't have this story, that, oh, he's trying to throw this right now. But the fact that he left both of these games with various ailments that are sort of undiagnosable to some degree, where it was a re-aggravation of an eye injury in one of them, and it was an illness in the other. So definitely a bit strange here. Does not look good for Porter. I mean, it's interesting how this all plays out because of the fact that Jontay Porter is on a two-way contract. Well, also, let's just start with this. The fact of, because again, I don't want to say all these things, put the blame on Porter, but not explain why this is so fishy, outside of the fact as well that he left both of these games. We're talking about Jontay Porter here. He is a player for the Toronto Raptors that is on a two-way contract and is getting under 15 minutes a game on the season. Now, if you are watching the Raptors, which I don't think that all that many people really are, they are down in the standings and are just sort of playing out the rest of the season for the sake of it. I know that they are trying because they don't have their own draft pick, but they're really in a rebuilding scenario here. Porter has been getting some more playing time for the Raptors this season, where he's played in 26 games. He's been getting some more minutes down the stretch. But again, it's kind of hard to say that this is a full coincidence that a player in Jontay Porter, who the majority of NBA fans probably don't really know of. You might know him because of the fact that he's Michael Porter Jr.'s brother, but ultimately he's not a high-profile player to the point where you have these stories that DraftKings had reported on the day after, that there were bets upwards of $10,000 on Jontay Porter's unders. a sane person would not do something like that. Now, again, that's sort of speculation there, but I can't imagine that people would really be throwing all this money on a two-way player that, again, just does not have that much name recognition as a whole. So it is definitely a very sketchy situation here for Porter. Now, he's being investigated. Nothing's fully been confirmed, but it was the fact that DraftKings reported on both of these occasions on January 26th and March 20th that Jontay Porter prop bets under were the most profitable bet of the day. Adrian Wojnarowski also put out that at least one other U.S. sportsbook detected unusual betting interest on Porter props. So, he also added to this same tweet saying that it was upwards of $10,000 and $20,000, which, again, is just an absurd amount of money to be putting on a rotational player like that. So it does not look good for him. Again, it's one thing when they're playing the games. It's way harder, obviously, to... No, I don't think any player could get away with fully throwing a game, actually being on the court to make that happen. But in these instances, the fact that Porter got on the court, gave some effort for a little bit, and then left the game with again, not a major injury. It just does not look good as a whole. We don't know anything definitively yet. I'm sure we'll get answers, but this does sort of take me into the bigger conversation about athletes potentially gambling. It's one of these things where I do feel like there is a portion of the not so much the media, but just NBA fans in general who say, well, the NBA promotes all of these betting books, and it's not just the NBA, it's really across America as a whole, all of these leagues, because they can make money from gambling, so they're promoting it. Well, why can't their athletes participate in it themselves? And to me, it's simple. It's just because those are the rules. It leads to a potentially slippery slope where you can have instances of throwing games, and it can ruin the credibility and integrity of the sport as a whole if you start playing these games. You can say that it's unfair that these players aren't able to, gamble on themselves and on the sports as a whole, but the reality is they're benefiting anyways from all of these sponsorships, because the fact that we have all of these sports books paying as much money as they are to be advertised by the leagues, it's helping to pay their contracts and their salaries, and they're getting a piece of it to some degree. No, you're not betting yourself and seeing those results come up in front of you, but at the same time, you can't go, a handful of years while you're in the league without gambling. You have such a finite time period that you are able to play a professional sport at the level of an NFL, an MLB, an NBA, any of those lines. And it's just one of the bylaws of the league. And to the argument that, well, all of these leagues are promoting it, so how it's too difficult for these players to, stay away from it. I don't really believe that these athletes that are getting caught with these gambling scandals are gambling just for the sake of, oh, well, I saw an ad on TV when I was watching an NBA game, or along those lines. It's because gambling is something that's been happening for, a lot of the entirety of sports as a whole. And I don't think that they're inspired just because an ad looks so cool that they want to get involved with it. It's the fact that gambling has been a very real thing in the sports world for a handful of years now, for decades really, and now because of the fact that it is regulated so much more and controlled through technology, that they're just getting caught easier than they ever have before. Which does sort of spark an interesting conversation as to how much do we think that professional athletes could have been gambling before all of this was regulated, and are there stories that we'll never know about? That's very possible, but it's just stupid for these athletes who are making, by the way, Jonte Porter, he's on a 2-way contract like I mentioned. I believe his contract is still over $400,000 a year. Let me double check that as we speak here, but I'm pretty sure that that's the case, that he's making this much money. His brother is Michael Porter Jr. He comes from a family where their dad is, or at least was, I'm not sure if he's still with Missouri. It's been a rough stretch for them. Yeah, $411,000 for Jonte Porter on a 2-way contract, let alone being an actual full-time NBA player. And, it just doesn't make sense to me why you would risk, especially betting on your own sport. And as it currently stands, the idea is that it wasn't he himself making these bets, but it was telling other people to bet on him, and maybe he gets a cut of it. Again, that's all speculation. I don't want to necessarily say anything untrue in that scenario, but there's just no need to sort of... that's about as dirty as it gets, as sort of throwing the unders on your own props. It's almost better if he's betting on his own over and he's trying to stat pad, as much as that would still be a big concern as well. That's what we saw with Pete Rose, the MLB manager, who was banned from baseball because he used to bet on the Cincinnati Reds, whom he managed. He used to bet on them winning games, and that has kept him banned from the game of baseball altogether. You talk about betting on your own unders and taking yourself out of a game because of that. I don't think that there's any option for the NBA other than to suspend him for life. In reality, it's not forgivable in my eyes, and I'm sure for his teammates as well, it's such a slap in the face to them, where, granted, it's not like Jonte Porter is a centerpiece of that Raptors team, but you go into the game with a game plan, and all of a sudden your teammate essentially quits on you because he's trying to help his friends out to make some money. So it's a horrendous look. I think that, again, as we find out more details about this, we can have more definitive statements, but I do think it looks really damning as things currently stand, and if he is guilty, his NBA career is over, which is just, again, I don't think that there's that much of an argument for the idea of athletes being able to bet on their own sport. I just can't really understand how anybody really gets behind that. If that's how you feel, so be it. But one way or another, the fact is the fact that it is the rule, and to risk throwing away your entire career at such a young age is a really stupid thing to do. And it is very discouraging. The NBA is going to definitely be looking into this, and we will keep you updated on all of the updates as they come out. But on that note, we are going to be taking our final break of the show. When we come back, we are going to be diving into the NFL and the rules that have come out of the owners' meeting. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome into the final segment of the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are going to be diving into the NFL here. We have had the owners meeting that has taken place over the past couple days, and we will be diving into some of the new rule changes, the first of which being the hip drop tackle. We touched on it briefly the other day, and it is a move that has a lot of people up in arms, so we will get into that. It is the banning of this form of tackle that is, very common in a lot of ways in the NFL, where it is essentially sort of whipping your body and coming down, dropping your weight backwards onto a ball carrier's leg. This has led to a handful of serious injuries over the past couple seasons. Mark Andrews suffered this injury on primetime football earlier this year that took him out for a lot of the season. We also had Tony Pollard have his season ended in a playoff game a couple years ago against the 49ers. This seemed like it was going to be something that was sort of going to happen one way or another. Jonathan Jones of CBS tweeted out a stat about how there were 230 of these instances in the 2023-24 season, and 15 times the ball carrier missed time due to an injury from the play. Now, that's only 6% of instances, so not a super high number by any means, but we have seen some serious injuries come of it as well. And again, I don't really feel too strongly one way or another as this. I understand the difficulties. It just seems like more and more rules are favoring the offensive players in the NFL, and that can be frustrating, especially to a lot of defenders. But it is something that, the priority for the NFL, other than making money, because that's the way that Roger Goodell thinks, and he's, trying to run his corporation, which again, can't fully blame him for it, but we just know that the NFL is a lot more selfish. It's a lot more run by the owners than it ever will be with the players. But keeping players healthy should be a top concern with them, and we saw a sort of decreased value of the game of football itself when all of the quarterbacks were injured this past year. Not that they were on hip drop tackle plays, but still generally you lose the best players on the field, the game does not look quite as good. So that is sort of a general statement for trying to keep players healthy. Now, could it have implications on defenders and sort of the restrictions on them? We've seen so many different ways that they can go to tackle be outlawed, such as diving at their knees as well, the ball carrier's knees as well. So the job just continues to get harder and harder for defenders in the league. There was a report that was put out about the NFL being concerned about the decrease in scoring the past couple years, and then this new rule comes into place. So there are some concerns about the future of the NFL in that sense, but it is, ideally for the sake of keeping players healthy. So I can understand it. Jonathan Jones reported that it's not likely to be flagged often in this upcoming season. Feel like we could be looking at a warning and then fine situation as they try and phase it out of the game. But, I guess we'll just have to see how the NFL decides to treat it. We're still a handful of months away from that, and it's going to be a storyline to look into. But some news that we got yesterday was the updated kickoff rules. The NFL decided that, last season, the kickoff almost became a pointless play where it was time after time again, kicked out of the back of the end zone, kicked for a touchback, and it was sort of just a nonsense play that meant nothing anymore. And I'm definitely going to miss the traditional kickoffs where just one of the most exciting plays in football and really in all of sports is when you see a kickoff return. Jacoby Jones's return in the Super Bowl against the 49ers was one of the, the first plays that really resonated with me. As a sports fan, I thought it was the coolest thing ever, but it had gotten to a point where there were a couple issues. One, in that the touchback rate was at an all-time high, and two, that there is also, to the note of injury concern, there was some of that with the kickoff rule as well, where we saw a change in the kicking team no longer being able to run up for the kick due to these high-speed collisions that put a lot of people at risk, especially on the blocking front line, as well as some of these, gunners on kickoff as well. So they changed a lot of things up in this situation where now there is a specific incentive for the kickers to try and place their kick in what is called the landing zone. That is from right outside of the other team's end zone to the 20-yard line. If the ball hits the landing zone and is fielded, then the return team is forced to return it. There's no more touchbacks in that sense. But there's a lot of different rules here where the ball is at the 20-yard line if it hits the landing zone and then rolls into the end zone. Again, incentivizing the returners in this situation to actually field the ball and return it themselves. The ball will be at the 35-yard line if the kick goes out of the end zone, which is pretty drastic in my eyes, but again, interesting. It's going to take a lot more precision for some of these kickoff specialists to actually make sure that they hit the zone they're looking for. And if the ball does not reach the landing zone, then the ball will be placed at the 40-yard line. My, first impression of that rule is to try and avoid just booting the ball straight at the front line and trying to, cause some sort of a fumble, like a non-onside kick, onside kick in some sense. But it has to reach the 20-yard line. Being put on the 40 is, again, a little bit extreme. Both the 40 and the 35 in these situations is definitely surprising to me to some degree. But they're trying to make sure that this actually becomes a non-gimmicky real play. It has worked in the XFL up to this point to some degree. Again, just to add some action to a play that has really been dead the past couple of seasons. So I'm not sure how it's totally going to play out. There's also part of it as well is the fact that there's no longer the surprise onside kick. You have to announce to the referees and to the opposing team that you are going to onside kick. Not that this was the most common of, plays to take place during the NFL as it were, but should be interesting. I'm going to have to follow up on trying to figure out some of these rules because where the onside kick really has been diminished over the past couple of years is because when the rule came into place that the kicking team could not have a running head start into the play, it made onside kicks almost impossible, where it just gives the receiving team that much more time to sort of secure the fumble. There's less pressure, and it is... Now we're at a point where I'm not sure if players can still run up on these plays, but the onside kick percentages were extremely low this past season, and the success rate was, there was very few instances of a team kicking an onside kick to actually recover this. There have been some talks about potentially even just removing the onside kick as a whole and trying to set up some sort of 4th and long situation as a replacement. We'll see how the onside kicks work on this season. as it plays out, but is another pretty interesting rule change to this as well. We'll see how all of this plays out. Should be a little bit of an interesting dynamic, trying to get special teams back to be an important part of the game and not really wasting everybody's time with the kickoff, where, again, the highs of the kickoff returns were some of the best moments in football. But last year there was clearly an issue with there was just no point in running them, essentially, and now the NFL has tried to address that. The final thing from the owners' meeting that sort of stood out to me, we've talked about some of the various, coaching interviews that took place, but the NFL also announced that they're going to be holding a game on Christmas this year, which is not all too, different. They've been having Christmas Eve games the past few years, but what's interesting about this is the fact that Christmas does fall on a Wednesday this year, meaning that whatever teams are participating in this game are going to have very short weeks one way or another. I'm not sure how they're going to line up the scheduling of this, because you talk about playing a game from Sunday to Wednesday. Football is just too dangerous of a sport to, really rush these types of games, and we already hear about some of the complaints about short weeks anyways when you have to play on a Monday and Sunday, let alone or a Thursday to Sunday. And now we're talking about a Wednesday game. I mean, this could be the future of the NFL. We've seen them flirt with the idea of adding more football games throughout the week, but how are they going to counteract this to make sure that it doesn't become a harmful, indictment to whatever teams are slotted into this game? I'm trying to think on how they could possibly make it work, whether it's they play maybe the Thursday night prior but they can't play the same team either unless they do some sort of no, it doesn't work that way. I'm trying to workshop here on the fly of how they could do it if they were maybe to play a Thursday night game the week before and then maybe a Monday night game the next, but that's 3 straight weeks of these two teams being on a weird schedule. Teams can't play each other 3 times in a row. So we'll see how they decide to work that all out. It is again, maybe a little bit of a glimpse of what is to come in the future of the NFL, because they're trying to monopolize all of sports and have games and viewership, every moment that they possibly can. We'll see how they decide to try and make it work this season, how the players react to it. It just caught my eye as something that was a little more under the radar, but was an interesting look at how it's going to be handled this season and moving forward in the NFL. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe, wherever you keep up with our shows. And we will be back tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. So we will see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.